The West was not built on gold or glory, but on silence. Silence between storms, silence in grief, silence in the eyes of men who buried too much and kept riding. Elias Holt was one of them, widowed, hollow, and wandering a land that gave nothing back but dust. On a storm-swept night, he found her by a creek, an Apache woman, half dead, breath shallow, rain washing the blood from her shawl. He could have turned away. Most men would have. Instead, he lifted her into the saddle and rode into the teeth of a town that would spit on them both. But mercy is never free. It binds, it scars, and sometimes it sets too. The wind had worn his name down to a whisper. Elias Holt rode across the barren land as though chased by ghosts, the weight of his saddle heavier than his years, heavier even than the rifle slung across his back. His horse's hooves struck dry, earth that crumbled into dust, each plume dissolving into the endless horizon. It was late autumn when the days were brittle and the nights cut to the bone. He rode without destination, for the map of his life had been burned and buried beside a grave years before. He had left behind a cabin that no longer felt like home, its rocking chair still creaking in memory of a wife who had once sown in its glow. Loneliness had followed him like a stray dog, close enough to gnaw at his heels, never close enough to kill. He sought no town, no company, only movement, only silence. That evening the sky opened without warning. Rain came sharp and cold, drumming against his hat, rolling down his coat in streams. He turned his horse toward the sound of rushing water, a creek swollen by storm. The ground softened beneath the hooves, sucking mud at each step. And there, half hidden by reeds and the gathering night, lay the shape of a woman. Elias reined, in hard. The horse snorted uneasy. She was crumpled in the wet grass, her skin pale beneath streaks of blood and dirt. Dark braids clung to her face, heavy with rain. He swung down, boots sinking into the mud. When he bent close, he saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest, fragile as a candle flame in wind. Her lips parted with a faint rasp, but no words came. Apache. The thought struck hard. Every scarred tale he had heard in saloons, every warning, spat from the mouths of settlers, returned to him in that moment. She bore the dress and ornaments of her people, though torn and stained. Her wrists carried marks of binding. Whoever had left her here had meant her to die. Elias's first instinct was to walk away. This was no burden for him to bear. She was not his kin, not his responsibility. To lift her would mean trouble, suspicion from whites, hatred from both sides. He stood in the rain, fists clenched, the ghosts of caution whispering. But then he remembered another night of rain, years ago, when he had dug a grave by lantern light and lowered into it the only woman he had ever loved. He had prayed someone. Anyone might have saved her from the sickness that carried her. No one had. He could not walk away. With a grunt, Elias stooped and slid his arms beneath her slight frame. She was fever-hot, limp as a dying bird. He carried her to the horse, lifted her into the saddle, then climbed up behind, steadying her against his chest. She murmured something faint, in a tongue not his own, and went still. The storm followed them into town. The settlement was a scatter of low buildings huddled against the wind, lanterns glowing faintly through sheets of rain. As Elias rode down, the muddy street doors opened, faces appeared. Conversation stilled. He felt their eyes sharpen, felt the air grow colder than the rain. By the time he dismounted before the livery, a crowd had begun to gather. "What's he got there?" someone called. "An Apache." God Almighty. Elias ignored them, half carrying, half dragging the woman toward the physician's door. The mutters grew. He caught words like dangerous. Why bring her here? Leave her to die like the rest. Someone spat into the mud at his feet. The doctor himself, a lean man with spectacles fogged by damp, opened the door a crack and froze at the sight. His hand lingered on the frame, unwilling to move. "I'll not have that under my roof," he said flatly. "She's dying. Elias replied. His voice was quiet but carried over the rain. Then let her die where she belongs. Elias stared at him, water dripping from the brim of his hat. The weight of the woman in his arms seemed heavier by the second. Around him, the townsfolk pressed, closer, faces hard, eyes glittering in the lantern light. It was as though the storm had driven them to cruelty, or perhaps it had only revealed what lived in them all along. "You'll bring trouble down on us, Holt," someone hissed. "You've lost your mind." Another muttered, "A man takes in a snake, he'll be bit. Remember that." Elias said nothing. He shifted her weight in his arms, looked once more at the doctor, then turned away. The crowd parted reluctantly, muttering like crows. Their judgment followed him down the street as he carried her toward the edge of town, toward his own weather-beaten cabin on the rise. Rain washed over both of them, cleansing nothing, only deepening the chill. By the time he laid her on the cot inside, the fire in his hearth had nearly gone to ash. He stirred it back to life, fed it kindling, then sat by the bed with a basin of water wiping blood and mud from her face. Her eyes flickered open once, dark and unfathomable, then closed again. In that flicker, he thought he saw something. Fear, defiance, or simply the will to live. Elias leaned back in the chair, the weight of silence pressing in. Behind him the storm rattled the shutters. Beyond that, the town simmered with resentment. He knew well enough he had bought himself nothing but solitude, suspicion, perhaps even danger. But as he sat watching the fragile rise and fall of her breath, Elias Holt felt no regret. Mercy, he knew, had never been a bargain with men. It was only a bargain with one's own soul, and so he chose it knowing full well the price. The cabin had long since ceased to feel like a home. Elias Holt had built it with his own hands years before, when he had been a younger man with a younger heart, a man who had believed a roof and a hearth could hold off the emptiness of the world. Now it stood like a husk at the edge of town, boards weathered gray, shutters rattling in every wind. He carried the Apache woman inside and laid her on the narrow cot that once had been his wife's. The quilt, faded from years of washing, still bore the faint scent of cedar and smoke. For a long while Elias stood over her, unsure if he had done her any kindness. The fever still gripped her breath shallow, her skin hot against the cool night air. He lit the lantern and tended to her wounds as best he could. Years on the trail had taught him a measure of rough medicine, how to clean a cut, how to draw out infection with whiskey, how to keep the weak from freezing. He worked in silence, his hands steady, his thoughts heavy. Days passed in a rhythm of rain and gray light. The storm lifted, but Elias felt no easing in himself. He rose with the dawn to fetch water, chopped wood, returned to find her still sleeping or tossing beneath the quilt. At night he sat in the rocking chair, its creak the only sound besides the crackle of the fire. He stared at her, at the hollow of her cheeks, at the braids that framed her face, loosened and tangled from hardship. It was on the third morning that she spoke. Her eyes opened, dark, searching, and a whisper came through cracked lips. A word he did not know. He leaned closer, frowning. She tried again, and this time he caught the shape of it. "Ahyoka." Elias sat back slowly. "Your name." She gave the faintest nod, then turned her face away, exhausted. "Ahyoka." The name settled into the room like a stone dropped in still water, ripples touching everything. She was no longer just the wounded stranger he had pulled from the creek. She had a name, and with it a story. Over the next days, fragments of that story came forth, not through long telling, but through gestures, broken words, the scars he could not help but see. Rope burns at her wrists, a mark at her temple where a rifle stock had struck. She did not dwell on them, and Elias did not press. They were both creatures who knew that some wounds were best carried in silence. He found himself watching her more than he should. She moved with a quiet strength, even in weakness, as though every breath she drew was wrested from fate itself. When she combed out her braids with trembling hands, he thought of his wife's hair, the way she had tied it back while kneeling over bread dough. The memory startled him, left him raw. His wife had been gone nearly 6 years, buried under the cottonwood that bent with age beside the creek. He had dug her grave himself, dirt blurring with tears he would never confess to anyone. After that, the cabin had become little more than a shelter. Her shawl still hung by the door, untouched. Her spindle and tools lay on the shelf as though waiting for hands that would never return. The rocking chair creaked, but no laughter filled it. He had grown used to the silence. Now, with another presence beneath his roof, the silence seemed louder, more demanding. One evening, as the fire burned low, Ahyoka sat upright on the cot for the first time. The light gilded her features, sharpened the planes of her face. She looked about the cabin slowly, taking in the tools, the empty chair, the shawl by the door. Her gaze lingered on the rocking chair, and Elias felt a jolt, as though she had looked through him into the heart of his grief. "You alone?" she said softly, her English broken but clear enough. Elias hesitated. He had grown used to walls, to the habit of keeping words locked away. Yet something in her tone, part statement, part question, drew a truth out of him. "Yes," he said. A long while. She nodded once, her eyes lowering. He realized then she carried her own solitude, heavier perhaps than his. Widowhood, abandonment. He did not know which, but he saw the echo of it in her stillness. They were two mirrors reflecting the same emptiness back at one another. The fire popped, scattering sparks. Outside, the wind worried at the walls. Inside, they sat without speaking further, yet something had shifted. The silence was no longer only his. It was shared. In the nights that followed, Elias found himself thinking of symbols he had long ignored. The shawl by the door seemed no longer just fabric, but a tether to memory. The rocking chair no longer just wood, but a marker of absence. Even the weather outside, rain, mist, or the brief glimmer of sun, felt like messages from a world determined to remind him that the past was never truly buried, and in Ahyoka's presence he saw the same weight. Her braids, carefully retied each morning despite her weakness, seemed like a ritual of holding on. Her scars, visible when the sleeves slipped back, spoke of survival rather than defeat. They were alike, not in culture or tongue, but in the stubborn refusal to yield entirely to loss. One dawn he found her sitting at the threshold, wrapped in the quilt, watching the sun lift pale over the horizon. Her face was unreadable, her eyes fixed far off as if seeing something beyond the plains. Elias poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one beside her. She looked at it, then at him, and after a long pause, took it. They drank in silence, steam rising between them. The moment was simple, almost fragile, yet Elias felt the stir of something he had not known in years, the recognition of another soul keeping watch with his. Shadows of the past still filled the cabin, yes, but they no longer pressed solely on him. They pressed on both, and in that shared weight, something like strength began to take root. The storm came down from the mountains like a living beast. By dusk, the horizon had vanished, swallowed in a wall of black cloud that rolled low and angry across the plains. The wind bent the cottonwoods until their branches clawed at the sky. Elias had known storms all his life, but this one had a violence in it, a weight that seemed to press against the very walls of the cabin. He barred the shutters as the first thunder cracked overhead. The sound rattled the tin dishes on the shelf, startled the horses in the lean-to. Lightning split the dark, searing the room in white. Ahyoka flinched, clutching the quilt tighter around her shoulders. Her eyes, usually unreadable, betrayed a flicker of unease. "It'll pass," Elias said, though his voice held little conviction. The rain struck next, hammering down with such force that the roof groaned. Water seeped beneath the door. The air grew close, heavy with smoke and damp wool. Elias set another log on the fire, its light leaping across the room, painting her face in flickers of gold and shadow. She still carried fever, though it had loosened its grip. He ladled broth from the pot and offered it to her in a tin cup. She hesitated, staring at him. the storm's roar filling the silence between them. At last she took it, sipping cautiously. Steam clouded the air between them. Their eyes met only, briefly. She did not thank him, perhaps she did not know the word in his tongue, or perhaps gratitude was too costly. Instead, she returned to the quilt, shrinking into its folds. Elias lowered himself into the rocking chair, rifle across his knees. He took out a cloth and whetstone, drawing the edge along the barrel and stock with slow, steady care. The rhythm of stone against steel filled the room, a sound both soothing and ominous. Ahyoka watched from the cot, her gaze sharp, unreadable. To her, he wondered, did the rifle look like protection or like threat? Outside, the storm raged. Rain pounded the roof until Elias feared it would give. A leak began near the hearth, dripping steadily into the ash bucket. He set another pan beneath the leak and tightened the beams where he could, but each new crack of thunder shook the timbers. Then, as if summoned by the storm itself, the roof gave a low, splintering groan. Elias rose at once, lantern in hand, climbing the ladder into the loft where the rafters bowed under the weight of water. He pressed his shoulder against the beam, but it was no work for one man alone. Ahyoka appeared behind him, still pale with fever, but her eyes steady. She gestured to the beam, then to her hands. Elias hesitated. She was weak still, but there was no time for protest. Together they braced their weight against the sagging wood, holding it as the rain hammered down. He felt her strength, surprising for her slight frame. Every breath she drew came hard, yet she pressed her shoulder firm against the timber. Their bodies leaned into the same weight, into the same fight against the storm. For a moment their eyes met in the dim lantern glow. There were no words, only the ragged sound of breathing and the fury of rain above them. At last the worst passed. The beam held. Elias nailed extra planks into place while Ahyoka steadied the lantern, her hands trembling but her stance unbroken. When he climbed down, she followed, both of them soaked in sweat though the room was cold. The fire had burned low. Elias crouched to stir it back to life, his fingers stiff. Ahyoka came near, laying another log across the coals without waiting for him to ask. Sparks leapt up, snapping like the echo of distant gunfire. For the first time since he had brought her here, their actions moved in rhythm, unspoken, born not of trust but necessity. The storm began to ease toward midnight, though its tail still rattled the shutters and sent the horses stamping restlessly outside. Elias sank back into the chair, exhaustion pulling at him. Across the room, Ahyoka sat on the edge of the cot, braid hanging loose over one shoulder. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the faint sheen of sweat from fever. She studied him openly now, her dark gaze following the rise and fall of his chest, the set of his jaw. He wondered what she saw, loneliness carved into lines, or the stubbornness of a man too weary to lay down. For his part, he saw the same fight in her that he had felt in himself for years, the refusal to break, even when all else had been stripped away. The night deepened. The storm at last began to stagger into silence, leaving only the drip of water from the eaves. Elias leaned his rifle against the wall and rubbed his eyes. When he looked up again, Ahyoka had pulled the quilt tighter and lay watching the fire, her face unreadable once more, yet something had changed. The space between them no longer felt like a gulf. It felt like a narrow road, still dangerous, still uncertain, but a road all the same. Elias closed his eyes, the chair creaking as it rocked gently. The storm had tested the roof, the beams, the very walls. It had tested them too. And though nothing had been spoken, he knew the storm had not broken either one. The storm had passed, but it left behind a hush that seemed heavier than the thunder had been. Days fell into a rhythm of small labors and unspoken glances. Ahyoka's strength returned slowly, the fever loosening its hold until her steps grew steadier. She took to helping in the cabin without being asked, carrying water in a tin pail, folding the quilt each morning, mending a split seam in Elias's shirt with the same patient precision that she used to braid her hair. Yet outside, Their walls the world was less forgiving. Word had spread through town, carried like smoke through dry grass. When Elias rode in for flour and coffee, the townsfolk met him with silence sharpened by suspicion. Whispers followed him down the street. Some spat into the mud as he passed, as though he carried a plague. One afternoon, a rancher named Barstow, a man with thick shoulders and a temper to match, blocked Elias in front of the mercantile. "You've lost your wits, Holt," he said, voice loud enough for every ear on the street. "Bringing her here, keeping her under your roof. You'll bring nothing but ruin." Elias met his eyes without flinching. "She was left to die. I couldn't ride past." Barstow spat at his boots. "A curse is what she is. You'll see it soon enough." Elias said nothing more. He lifted the sack of flour and walked past, but the weight of those eyes lingered on his back all the way home. Inside the cabin, Ahyoka seemed to sense the unease pressing at the door. She asked little, spoke less, but her silence carried an edge. One evening, while Elias was mending a harness by lamplight, she sat across from him on the cot, hands folded in her lap. Her gaze was steady, her words careful in his tongue. "You saved me," she said. "So, you and I, bound." Elias paused, thread still in his hand. "Bound?" She touched her chest, then gestured toward him. "Your life, my life, Apache way, marriage." The word landed heavy in the room. Elias stared at her, breath caught. Marriage. The sound of it stirred the ghost of another woman. Another vow spoken under the shade of a cottonwood tree years ago. He saw her face pale with fever, her smile faint but steady as she told him she would not fear leaving him alone. He had sworn then never to give his heart again. Now this woman, a stranger still, sat before him and spoke the word as if it were not a choice, but a truth written by her people's law. "I buried a wife," Elias said at last, his voice low. "I swore that grave would be the end of it." Ahyoka held his gaze, her dark eyes unwavering. "The dead still walk with us," she said. "But we walk too, not only them." Her words lingered long after she lay down to sleep. Elias sat by the fire, staring into its shifting embers. The rocking chair creaked beneath him, the sound of his solitude now carrying a question he could not silence. The days that followed grew taut, like a rope pulled near to breaking. Every gesture, every glance carried a weight that neither of them spoke aloud. In the mornings, when Elias poured coffee into 2 cups, his hand brushed hers as he passed it across the table. The touch was brief, accidental, but it lingered like a spark. She lowered her gaze, fingers curling around the tin cup with care. One afternoon, while hanging a damp shawl near the hearth to dry, she dropped it. Elias stooped at the same time. She did, and for a moment their hands closed on the same fabric. Their eyes met, hers guarded, his caught between resistance and something he feared to name. He released the cloth quickly, retreating into silence. At night, as the fire dwindled, Elias sharpened his rifle or carved at a piece of wood, his hands restless with the need to keep busy. Ahyoka would sit on the cot, braiding her hair by firelight. The braid itself became a kind of ritual. Each twist and fold a sign of order wrestled from chaos. He found himself watching, the movement hypnotic, and when she caught his gaze, he looked away as if burned. The cabin became both shelter and battleground, safe from the wind, yet charged with a storm of its own. He wanted to protect her, yet he feared the binding her people's law demanded. She, in turn, carried both gratitude and expectation, her silence heavier than any words. One evening, the tension broke not in anger, but in a quiet confession. Elias stood at the door, staring out at the dim glow of town lights far below. "They say you'll bring me ruin," he muttered. Behind him, her voice came steady. "Maybe, or maybe I bring you life." He turned then, slowly. She sat by the fire, her face calm, her eyes deep as the night sky. The room was hushed but alive, like the moment before rain. Elias felt his chest tighten, the air thick. He thought of the rocking chair, of the shawl still hanging by the door, of the grave, under the cottonwood. And then he thought of this woman, scarred, silent, unyielding, who had brought her own storm into his world. He could not answer her. Not yet. Instead, he turned back to the door, to the darkness beyond. The night offered no clarity, only the weight of choice pressing harder with each passing day. The first sign of trouble came with the smoke. It was dusk when Elias stepped outside, lantern in hand, and saw a thin gray thread curling upward beyond the ridge. Smoke that was too heavy for a cook fire, too dark for a hearth. The wind carried. The smell of burning wood, then something harsher. The scent of fear carried on the air. By the time he saddled his horse, the sound of shouting carried faint on the breeze. Raiders, outlaws who circled the settlements like wolves, striking when the moon was high or the people unguarded. Elias's gut clenched. He turned to find Ahyoka standing in the doorway, shawl about her shoulders, her eyes steady. "You'll not ride alone," she said, voice quiet but firm. Elias opened his mouth to protest, but she had already lifted the rifle from its place, by the door. She checked the chamber with the ease of long practice. Her braid swung over her shoulder, loose strands whipping in the wind. She was no longer the frail figure he had carried from the creek. She stood with the stance of one who had known danger and would not bow to it. They rode hard toward town, hooves striking sparks against stone. By the time they reached the outskirts, the fire had spread across the fields, licking at fences and haystacks. Shadows darted in the glow, raiders, rifles flashing, shouts breaking the night. The townsfolk scrambled, many unarmed, some clutching children to their skirts. Elias dismounted first, pulling his rifle free. Ahyoka swung down beside him, her eyes scanning the chaos. A lantern shattered against the dirt near them, flames scattering like startled birds. She lifted the rifle and fired, the crack ringing sharp, dropping one raider where he stood. The sound turned heads. For an instant, all eyes, townsfolk and raiders alike, saw her. Some with shock, some with anger. But Elias only felt a strange surge in his chest, pride, sharp as the sting of fire. "Take the west flank," he called to her, and she nodded without hesitation. They fought side by side, moving with a rhythm born not of long partnership, but of necessity and instinct. Elias covered her as she reloaded, her braid whipping like a banner as she turned, leveled, fired. The firelight cast her in shifting gold, every motion a defiance against the fate that had tried to leave her broken in the mud. The raiders pressed, hard. But Elias and Ahyoka held. Townsfolk, seeing them stand unbroken, gathered courage. A farmer brought buckets to douse the spreading flames. A blacksmith swung a hammer like a weapon. Together they pushed back the chaos until at last the raiders broke, scattering into the darkness like smoke and wind. When silence returned, it came heavy and raw. The fields smoldered, fences reduced to blackened skeletons. Townsfolk stood in clusters, some weeping, some staring wide-eyed at the woman who had fought to defend them. Where once they had whispered curse, now they whispered something else. Words. Elias could not quite hear, but he saw the change in their faces. Ahyoka leaned against the fence post, breathing hard, rifle still in her hands. The braid had come half loose, strands falling wild around her face. Her eyes found Elias's across the embers. For a long moment, neither moved. He crossed to her slowly, boots crunching on the charred ground. In the glow of the dying fire, he saw the smudge of ash across her cheek, the rawness of her hands. She met his gaze, steady as ever, but there was something new there too, something softer, though no less strong. "You fight like you were born to it," Elias said, his voice rough. Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "I fight because I must." They stood in silence, the world around them hushed save for the crackle of embers. The walls that had hemmed them in for weeks seemed to loosen, crumble, not in some sudden rush of passion, but in a quiet acknowledgement, fragile and reverent, of what they had endured together. Elias reached up without thinking, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She did not flinch. Her eyes closed for an instant beneath his touch, then opened again, darker, deeper than the night sky. He drew back slowly, hands rough and uncertain. She did not reach for him, nor he for her. Yet something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that neither was alone in grief nor in the fight to live beyond it. The townsfolk began to gather what they could, murmuring among themselves. Some glanced toward Elias and Ahyoka, their faces unreadable. But no one spat. No one cursed. Perhaps fire had burned some of the bitterness from them. Perhaps survival had forged a new kind of respect. Elias did not care. His eyes were only on her. Later, when the flames had died to embers and the townsfolk drifted back to their homes, Elias and Ahyoka remained by the charred fence line. He sat on the rail, weary, rifle resting across his knees. She stood nearby, shawl wrapped around, her shoulders, her braid trailing loose down her back. For a long while they said nothing. The night was vast and empty, yet filled with the echo of what they had done, what they had faced together. At last Elias spoke, voice low. "You're no burden." Her head turned, eyes meeting his. "You're a mirror," he said, words halting, almost torn from him. "Of everything I've carried. Of what it means to keep standing." Ahyoka's gaze softened, though no tears came. She reached out, touched his scarred hand lightly, just for a heartbeat. Then she let it fall. That was enough. The fire between them did not blaze like wildfire. It glowed steady as coals, quiet, enduring. And as the first chill of dawn crept across the land, Elias knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, not bound by chains of circumstance, but by the choice to remain unbroken side by side. By morning, the smoke had thinned, leaving the air bitter with ash. The town gathered at the square, drawn by habit and fear alike. The meeting was not called, yet no one needed summons. Hard nights always ended in judgment. Elias stood with Ahyoka. Beside him, his hat pulled low, his shoulders heavy with the weariness of battle and sleepless hours. The fire had blackened more than fields. It had left a mark upon the people who now ringed them, eyes sharp and uncertain. The preacher spoke. First, his voice thin against the hush. "It was not right, Holt. Bringing her here. You've tied us to danger. Apache blood draws Apache vengeance." A murmur rippled, some nodding, others keeping their gaze lowered. Yet no one stepped forward to drive her out. Their silence held the weight of last night's fire, the memory of the braid that flashed in its glow, the rifle that spoke with a steady hand. A rancher spat into the dirt. "What's to stop the next band from riding in when they hear one of theirs is harbored? Here. You want to see your children's throats cut?" Elias felt the heat rise in him, but his voice, when it came, was low and even. "What stopped those raiders last night was not fear, but fire met with fire. She fought for this town. For you. When your hands trembled, hers did not." He turned slightly, meeting Ahyoka's gaze. She stood silent, shawl wrapped about her, shoulders, her chin unbowed. Her eyes gave nothing away, yet her presence was louder than any words he could summon. Another voice, older, rougher, spoke from the edge of the crowd. "The blacksmith. She bled for us. That is more than can be, said for half this square." The silence deepened. Children shifted restlessly. Women clutched shawls tighter. Elias stepped forward then, boots grinding into ash-soft soil. "I'll speak plain," he said, voice carrying though it never rose. "I buried a wife years past under the cottonwood by my land. Thought I'd buried myself with her. But the world kept on, and it left me walking like a ghost. This woman was left to die in the mud, same as I was left to die in my own silence. I chose not to walk past. I chose to carry her back. And I will keep carrying her, whether you spit at my feet or not." His hand brushed the brim of his hat, settling it firm. "By her people's law, my act bound me to her. By my own code, I'll not break what was bound in blood and fire. If you cannot abide that, then let your judgment fall on me, not her." The preacher shifted uncomfortably. The rancher muttered. But no one stepped forward. No stone was thrown, no rifle raised. The crowd, weary as he was, seemed hollowed out by smoke and loss. In their silence was not acceptance, but something, harder to name, a space carved by respect, by unease, by the recognition that dignity sometimes walks a road they dare not follow. Ahyoka moved then, one step closer to Elias. Her hand, scarred but steady, brushed against his, not clasping, not claiming, merely present. The smallest gesture, yet in it lived a vow neither needed to speak. The meeting dissolved slowly. Families turned away, back to their charred fields, their half-burned barns. The preacher closed his Bible without another word. Only the blacksmith lingered long enough to nod once toward Elias, a nod that held the weight of quiet acknowledgement. When at last the square emptied, Elias exhaled. The morning was pale, the sky dim with the promise of snow. He turned to Ahyoka. "Are you ready?" She looked at the horizon, then back at him. "Yes." They saddled the horse together. The saddle creaked beneath their hands, the leather stiff, with cold. Ahyoka's braid had loosened again, strands catching the light of dawn. Elias found himself tying the strap slower than needed, simply to stand near her a moment longer. When all was set, he swung up into the saddle, then offered his hand. She placed hers in his, light but firm, and mounted behind him. The contact was brief, but it carried the weight of all they had endured. The storm, the whispers, the fire. They rode out not with speed nor triumph, but with a steady pace. Hooves thudding against the frozen earth. Behind them the town shrank, its rooftops smudged with soot, its people turning inward to nurse both wounds and grudges. Ahead lay the wide plains, scarred yet waiting. Snow began to fall, soft and soundless. It clung to Elias's coat, to Ahyoka's shawl, to the brim of his hat. The flakes blurred the horizon, shrouding the past in a white veil. Neither spoke. Words felt too small. Instead, Elias felt the shift in his chest, the loosening of something long bound. He thought of the rocking chair back at the cabin, the shawl folded on the shelf, the grave beneath the cottonwood. He thought of scars, his, hers, and how they had ceased to feel like chains and begun to feel like threads, weaving them forward. The land stretched endless before them, quiet beneath the falling snow. Elias's hands tightened on the reins. Behind him he felt Ahyoka's presence, not leaning, not clinging, but steady. Her silence no longer a shadow, but a companion. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years Elias did not fear its length. Together they rode into the dawn, two wounded souls carrying their past not as a burden, but as proof they had endured. And in the hush of snow, the world seemed, for a breath, at peace.